Somebody just told TMZ they have video of Nancy Guthrie with her kidnapper on what they're calling her last day alive. There's a new email sitting in Harvey Levin's inbox at TMZ right now. And if even half of what it claims is true, this is the biggest break in the Nancy Guthrie case since it started back in February. The person writing it says they have footage. Not a description, not a secondhand account passed along by someone who heard it from someone else. Actual video sitting on an actual phone showing Nancy Guthrie with the man investigators have been referring to as the main kidnapper on what this person describes as probably her last day alive, and they want 1 Bitcoin for it. At today's price, that's somewhere around $58,000. Before you get excited and before you get angry, I want to walk you through this whole thing slowly, because there are smart, experienced people landing on opposite sides of whether this is real, and you deserve to hear the actual case for and against before you make up your own mind. This is going to be a long one, and I'm not rushing it. Let's set the table first, because there's a lot of moving pieces here, and if you haven't been following every twist since February, I want you fully caught up before we get into what's new. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She's the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the longtime co-anchor of the Today Show. In the early morning hours of February 1st, she vanished from her home in the Catalina foothills area outside Tucson, Arizona. What was left behind painted an immediately alarming picture. Blood on the front porch. A blood trail leading away from the house. Signs that someone had forced their way in. And footage from a doorbell camera showing a masked, armed individual at her front door in the dead of night. Someone who appeared to know exactly where that camera was and spent time near it before ever going inside. 10 days after she vanished, the FBI released those doorbell images publicly and described that man as a suspect. Nancy was described by her family as small in stature, fragile, dependent on daily medication. Savannah said publicly, through tears, that her mother had been taken in her pajamas, with no shoes and without that medication. In the weeks that followed, ransom notes started arriving, not to the family directly, but to media outlets. 3 separate organizations received them, 2 Tucson television stations and TMZ. Most experts now believe 2 of those early notes were likely genuine, sent from the same digital source. The first one demanded several $million in Bitcoin, and, more importantly, contained specific details about the inside of Nancy's home that had never been made public. The exact location of a personal item in her bedroom, a broken light fixture on her back porch. Details nobody outside that house, or close to whoever was inside that house, should have had access to. A second note arrived days after the first. This one didn't ask for anything at all. It stated that Nancy had died, that whoever wrote it claimed it wasn't supposed to happen that way, that her remains had been left somewhere out in the natural landscape, described in language that struck a lot of people as oddly gentle for something so brutal. That's the foundation. 5 months of searching, no arrests, no charges, no confirmed recovery, and in the background, this strange, ongoing thread of communication that has never fully stopped. Now here's what's actually new, and why we're making this video today. Since those 2 original notes, TMZ has continued to receive messages from someone, or possibly more than one someone, claiming deeper knowledge of who is responsible, names, addresses, phone numbers allegedly. And now, in the most recent message, a claim that goes further than anything that's come before it. An actual video, on an actual phone, showing Nancy with her main captor. According to this person, the phone is currently powered off and sitting in what they describe as a secure location. Not a safe deposit box. They're specific about ruling that out, but somewhere discreet. Somewhere that would be easy to find, only if you already knew exactly where to look. Their offer is straightforward on the surface. 1 Bitcoin, and they'll hand over everything. The location, the password. Full access, their words, not mine, delivered on a silver platter. That phrase, silver platter, has stuck with nearly everyone covering this story since it surfaced. It's an unusually casual, almost theatrical way to describe handing over evidence connected to what may be a homicide. It doesn't read like language from someone in genuine danger, desperate to unload information safely. It reads like a sales pitch. And I'll be honest, That's the part that bothers me the most out of everything in this case. Not the Bitcoin demand, not the secrecy, that specific phrase. Somebody allegedly sitting on footage of an 84-year-old woman in the last hours of her life, and the word they reach for is platter. And that contradiction, the high stakes of the claim against the strangely low stakes of the language used to describe it, is exactly where this story starts to fracture into two very different interpretations. Let's start with the skeptics, because the skepticism here is loud, and it's coming from people whose entire careers are built around separating real evidence from manufactured noise. The most basic argument is this: a claim is not evidence. Anyone with an internet connection and a working knowledge of this case from following news coverage can write an email saying they have proof of something. The proof either exists in a verifiable form or it doesn't, and right now, nothing has been verified. One cybersecurity expert who has spent years training federal investigators specifically on internet-based crime put it plainly. In his assessment, nothing in this third wave of communications, the messages that came after the original two notes, contains a single piece of information that couldn't have been assembled by anyone paying close attention to the publicly available coverage. No proprietary detail, nothing that only a person with genuine inside knowledge would know. He also raised what might be the cleanest argument against this being legitimate, and it's worth sitting with because it's so logical. If you genuinely possess a piece of digital evidence this significant, there is a completely standard, low-risk way to monetize it responsibly without exposing yourself to danger or fraud on either side. You set up an escrow arrangement. A neutral third party holds the agreed payment. You hand over the device or the access. Once it's verified as authentic, the funds release. Nobody has to trust anybody blindly. That mechanism exists. It's used constantly in exactly these kinds of high-stakes information exchanges, and nobody making this claim has proposed anything close to it. Instead, here's what actually happened. The people covering the story directly asked the letter writer to simply send a screenshot, blur the alleged kidnapper's face if necessary. Just provide something, anything, that demonstrates this footage actually exists. The response came back a couple of hours later. They refused, citing fear that metadata embedded in the image could be traced back to them and that the people actually responsible for this crime, according to this person, already know exactly who they are and would retaliate. Here's the problem with that explanation, and multiple experts independently flagged the exact same inconsistency. Stripping metadata from a digital image before sending it is one of the simplest tasks in basic digital security. It is not advanced. It does not require specialized training. If someone is sophisticated enough to operate anonymous Bitcoin wallets that federal investigators with significant resources apparently still haven't been able to trace, and sophisticated enough to route communications through anonymizing relay services, then claiming ignorance about how to remove metadata from a single photo simply does not track. Those are not skills that exist at wildly different levels within the same person. Either this is someone with real technical capability choosing for some reason not to provide proof, or this is someone without any real material at all, hiding behind a technical-sounding excuse that falls apart under basic scrutiny. And then there's the money question, which might be the most intuitively obvious red flag of the entire situation, the one that doesn't require any technical background to understand. There is currently a combined reward between the Guthrie family and law enforcement worth more than $1.2 million for information that leads directly to a resolution of this case. If a person genuinely knows who did this and where Nancy's remains are located, the math doesn't make sense. Why pursue one Bitcoin, roughly $58,000, through an anonymous, legally murky channel involving a tabloid news outlet when over $1 million legitimate dollars sits available through a completely legal, protected pathway? That gap in logic is enormous. It's the kind of inconsistency that, on its own, makes a lot of experienced investigators deeply doubtful. Now, with all of that skepticism laid out, here's why this case refuses to be dismissed entirely. Because the picture is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Here is the detail that keeps pulling serious people back into taking this seriously. Savannah Guthrie herself, in a televised interview, stated directly that she tends to believe 2 of the earlier ransom notes were real, not all of the communications that have come in since. Specifically those original 2, the initial demand and the follow-up admitting Nancy had died. And this newest message, the one referencing the phone and the video, allegedly includes a Bitcoin wallet address matching one used in those earlier, credible notes. An address that, according to people directly involved in receiving these communications, was never made public anywhere. If that detail holds up, it creates a real chain of connection. If the first 2 notes are genuinely tied to whoever is responsible, and this new message uses the identical financial fingerprint as those notes, that's not nothing. That suggests, at minimum, that whoever is writing now has some connection to the original communications, even if the specific claim about a video remains unverified. That's the tension, sitting at the center of this entire story. The pattern looks connected, the proof does not exist. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, and reconciling them is exactly what investigators are stuck trying to do right now. There was also a smaller, more behavioral detail that came up in recent analysis, and it's worth including even though it's far from conclusive. A former FBI agent who reviewed Savannah's televised comments noted something subtle in how she delivered that specific line about believing the notes were real. Throughout the rest of that interview, she maintains steady eye contact with her co-host, speaks fluidly, the kind of composed delivery you'd expect from someone who is, after all, a trained attorney and an experienced broadcaster used to live television. But in that one specific moment, discussing the 2 notes, her eyes shift briefly away from the camera before she says she believes them to be real. What does that actually mean? Honestly, it could mean almost anything. It could reflect careful word choice, because she's working closely with federal investigators and didn't want to reveal too much. It could reflect genuine uncertainty bleeding through a controlled public appearance. It could mean absolutely nothing. People glance away during interviews constantly for reasons that have zero connection to deception or hesitation. But it sparked real discussion among people who study behavioral cues professionally about whether Savannah's on-air statement was entirely her own independent conclusion, or whether it may have been something law enforcement encouraged her to say publicly as part of an active investigative strategy. That theory works like this. When investigators want to keep a potential suspect engaged and communicating, sometimes the most effective approach is publicly validating that previous messages were taken seriously. It encourages continued contact. It increases the chances that whoever is writing these notes eventually makes a mistake that can be traced. People who work cases like this sometimes call it "catch me if you can." Several experts discussing this case raised the genuine possibility that Savannah's public comment may have been at least partially strategic, something discussed with and encouraged by federal investigators rather than purely a spontaneous personal belief stated on live television. Nobody can confirm that theory either way, but it's a real, seriously considered possibility among people who've spent entire careers working cases exactly like this one. Let's go back to those original details for a moment, the ones from the very first note, because they don't get nearly enough sustained attention, and they matter enormously for understanding why investigators haven't simply written off this entire thread of communication. That first note reportedly described, with real specificity, where a particular personal item, something small, something easily overlooked, was positioned within Nancy's bedroom. Not just that the item existed somewhere in the house, but its precise location in a way that wouldn't be an obvious guess for someone who'd never actually been inside. It also referenced a broken outdoor light fixture near the back of the home. There's actually internal debate among investigators about how compelling each of those 2 specific details really is. The broken light fixture, some argue, isn't necessarily damning on its own. Someone conducting surveillance of the property from the outside, watching from a car, from the street, from a neighboring yard, could plausibly notice something like a malfunctioning exterior light without ever setting foot inside the home. It's the kind of detail patient outdoor observation could reveal. But the specific positioning of a personal item inside the bedroom is much harder to explain away through outdoor surveillance alone. And there's an additional detail that surfaced more recently that deserves real weight. Reports indicate Nancy left the home without her slippers, and that she reportedly kept those slippers in the exact same spot, night after night, out of long-standing habit. Small domestic details like that, things rooted in someone's private daily routine, the kind of pattern only visible to someone who has actually observed a person's home life closely over time, are nearly impossible to guess from outside. You'd need to have either been physically inside that house or received that information directly from someone who had been. That's ultimately why, even with all the legitimate skepticism surrounding this newest Bitcoin demand, investigators haven't simply dismissed the broader thread of communications as one continuous hoax. Something about the earliest messages carried real substance, real specificity, that's difficult to explain through public information alone. The open question, the one nobody has definitively answered, is whether everything that has followed since those first two notes actually traces back to that same legitimate original source, or whether opportunists have been piggybacking on a real and devastating crime, using publicly known fragments of the case to extract money from a grieving, high-profile family who is desperate enough for answers that they'll take almost any lead seriously. There's another layer to all of this that's hard to ignore, and it concerns who might actually be responsible for writing some of these more recent communications. The FBI has reportedly suggested, based on an analysis of writing style, word choice, and overall tone, that at least one of the more recent messages may have been authored by a woman, not the man visible in the doorbell camera footage. A separate author entirely, someone distinct from whoever physically entered that home and took Nancy. If accurate, that raises a significant possibility that more than one person currently holds knowledge of what actually happened that night, and that some of those individuals were not directly involved in the abduction itself, but became aware of it afterward. Perhaps through a personal relationship with someone who was involved. Perhaps through overhearing something they were never meant to hear in the first place. One expert raised a point worth sitting with on this. A significant number of major criminal cases over the decades have ultimately been solved not through forensic breakthroughs, but because someone close to the person responsible, a partner, a former partner, someone with an intimate personal connection, eventually could no longer carry the weight of what they knew. Sometimes that comes from guilt that builds over time. Sometimes it comes from a relationship deteriorating and whatever loyalty existed disappearing along with it. If a woman really is involved in these more recent communications, and she wasn't part of the original abduction, her motivations could be entirely different from whoever sent those first two notes. Guilt, fear of being implicated herself. Possibly even some complicated sympathy for a grieving family, tangled up with an attempt to profit financially from information she happens to possess. None of that makes her specific claims automatically true, but it does make the psychology underlying this entire situation considerably more layered than a simple binary of professional scammer versus credible informant. Now to the doorbell camera footage itself, because there's a theory about it circulating among investigators that fundamentally reframes how this entire case should be understood, and it didn't receive nearly the attention it deserved when it first surfaced. For much of the early public conversation around this case, there was an assumption, understandable given how little information was available, that this might have been an attempted burglary that spiraled catastrophically out of control. Wrong house, wrong night, something escalated unexpectedly into violence. But one expert in cybersecurity and behavioral intelligence laid out a substantially different reading of the available evidence, and it becomes difficult to dismiss once you actually walk through the specifics. The man visible on that doorbell camera does not behave like someone who is nervous, improvising, or operating without a plan. He appears entirely comfortable in that environment. He clearly knows exactly where the camera is positioned relative to his body. He spends a significant amount of time, reportedly more than 40 minutes, inside the home itself, according to the timeline investigators have pieced together from available footage. And critically, there's reason to believe a similar visit occurred at that same property weeks earlier, back in January, well before the actual abduction took place in February. If that detail is accurate, it strongly suggests this was not a random or opportunistic act. It suggests deliberate reconnaissance, someone scouting the property in advance. Becoming familiar with the camera angles, the household routine, the layout, the points of entry, long before ever returning to actually take Nancy from her home. There's also a specific theory about why the doorbell camera was ultimately removed entirely from its mounting, rather than simply avoided or covered. The obvious surface-level assumption is that it was taken down to conceal his face from identification, but there's a more specific, evidence-based alternative explanation. The blood trail documented at the scene reportedly stops abruptly right at the edge of the driveway, which strongly suggests Nancy was placed into a waiting vehicle at that exact point. If the actual goal was preventing that vehicle, its make, its color, any identifying characteristics whatsoever, from ever appearing on camera, removing the entire doorbell device accomplishes that far more thoroughly and permanently than simply avoiding eye contact with the lens while wearing a mask. If that reading is correct, this case stops looking like an opportunistic crime that spiraled out of control. It starts looking like a carefully planned, specifically targeted abduction carried out by someone who had actually studied this house, this routine, this elderly woman's daily patterns, well in advance of ever stepping inside. There's also something messier here, an unavoidable part of this story, whether anyone particularly likes discussing it, and that's the ongoing friction surrounding how local law enforcement has handled the public-facing side of this entire investigation. There has been real, openly expressed frustration from multiple people closely following this case regarding how much information the sheriff's office has shared publicly in real time, sometimes apparently without full coordination with federal partners working the same investigation. Specific crime scene details disclosed early on. Statements regarding evidence that were never meaningfully followed up on or clarified afterward. Public comments made on morning television, casting doubt on certain leads or theories without much supporting elaboration. The core criticism here isn't necessarily that information was shared at all. Transparency has real value, particularly in a case where the public has been desperate for any kind of update for months. The criticism centers more on consistency and on how publicly available crime scene details make it considerably harder to distinguish a truly informed source, someone with genuine inside knowledge, from someone who simply paid extremely close attention to press conferences and news coverage. If specific factual details about the crime scene were stated publicly by officials early in the investigation, and those same details later appear inside a ransom note, that overlap doesn't necessarily prove the note writer had real inside knowledge. It might simply mean they were watching the news closely and took careful notes. Call it the contamination problem. It's one of the trickiest aspects of evaluating any of these later communications fairly. Once certain details become public, even partially, even through indirect channels, anyone with enough patience can incorporate those fragments into a fabricated claim and make it sound considerably more credible than it actually is. Here's the broader mechanics of how a case like this typically gets solved, because it provides useful context for where things currently stand. In genuine, professionally executed kidnapping for ransom cases, communication patterns tend to follow fairly predictable structures. Contact is made directly and privately with the family, not broadcast across multiple media outlets simultaneously. Negotiations happen quietly, methodically, with the explicit goal of avoiding exactly the kind of public spectacle this case has generated. Threats of violence, when they occur at all, tend to escalate gradually rather than appearing immediately in an opening communication. What's happened here breaks from that pattern in multiple, significant ways. Communications went to media outlets rather than exclusively to the family. An explicit threat of violence appeared remarkably early, within the very first substantive communication, according to people who received it directly. And the overall behavior pattern, demanding money publicly, then admitting death days later, then continuing to send tips and claims for additional money through a tabloid outlet rather than directly to law enforcement, doesn't resemble the behavior of an organized, professional criminal operation with experience running these kinds of cases. What it more closely resembles, according to people who've spent careers around exactly this kind of crime, is something improvised, something where meaningful planning extended only as far as the actual abduction itself, and essentially stopped there. Someone, or some small group of people, who thought carefully about how to remove Nancy from her home undetected, and considerably less carefully about what to actually do with her, or with the situation once that part was accomplished. There's also the matter of how Bitcoin actually works as a tracing tool, because a lot of the public conversation around this case has gotten the mechanics slightly wrong. Bitcoin transactions are not anonymous in the way people often assume. Every single transaction is permanently recorded on a public ledger, visible to anyone who knows how to look. What makes Bitcoin difficult to trace isn't the transaction itself, it's connecting a particular wallet address to a real human identity. As long as money sits inside a wallet, untouched, investigators can watch it, but they can't necessarily identify whose hands are behind it. The real vulnerability comes the moment someone tries to convert that Bitcoin into actual spendable currency, moving it through an exchange, linking it to a bank account, cashing it out somehow. That's the moment a real identity typically gets exposed, because financial institutions require identification to convert cryptocurrency into usable funds. This is part of why the earlier decision by investigators to deposit a relatively small amount of money into the original wallet, rather than the full ransom amount, has been so heavily scrutinized and criticized after the fact. The theory was that any movement of funds out of that wallet would create the exact vulnerability needed to trace the person behind it. But the amount deposited was small enough that it apparently never motivated whoever controlled that wallet to actually move the money at all. It just sat there, untouched, and whatever window existed to trace a meaningful transaction closed without ever opening. If this new claim about a video is genuine, and if whoever is behind it actually receives a Bitcoin payment, the same fundamental vulnerability would apply. The moment that Bitcoin moves anywhere toward conversion into real currency, federal investigators with the right tools, watching the right wallet address, would have a genuine opportunity to trace it. Which raises an obvious question. If this person is even moderately aware of how cryptocurrency tracing works, and their previous behavior suggests at least some technical sophistication, why would they risk exposing themselves through exactly the kind of transaction that's historically led to major arrests in other cases? That's one more inconsistency sitting inside an already inconsistent set of claims. Going back to the reward money for a second, because it deserves more than a passing mention. $1.2 million. Sitting there, available right now, today, to anyone who comes forward with real information through the legal channel. That number isn't small. That's the kind of money that changes a person's life completely. Pays off a house, pays off debt, sets up kids, grandkids, whoever. And it's sitting there untouched, while somebody allegedly holding the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case is instead asking a tabloid for $58,000 in cryptocurrency. That gap is big enough that it almost stops making sense as a financial decision. And once something stops making sense as a financial decision, you have to start asking what kind of decision it actually is. Is it fear? Is it distrust of law enforcement specifically? Some people just don't trust the system, and if you're somehow connected to a kidnapping, even on the edges, even as a bystander who found something out after the fact, walking into an FBI field office probably feels like walking into a trap regardless of the reward sitting on the table. Or is it something simpler? Is it somebody who doesn't actually have anything, betting that the emotional weight of this case, an 84-year-old woman, a famous daughter, a missing mother, is enough to get a payday out of a tabloid that's motivated to chase a story, regardless of how solid the proof is? Both of those explanations are plausible. Neither one gets to be ruled out yet. There's something else worth sitting with, and it's about TMZ itself, because not enough thought goes into why these messages keep landing there specifically instead of anywhere else. TMZ isn't a law enforcement contact. It's not a hotline. It's a tabloid newsroom with a business model built around being first, and whoever is sending these messages clearly understands that. They're not emailing the Pima County Sheriff's Office. They're not calling the FBI tip line. They're going straight to the outlet most likely to publish something fast, with the least friction and the most attention. That's a strategic choice. Somebody picked TMZ on purpose. And that tells you something about the motivation here, regardless of whether the underlying claim turns out to be true or false. If your goal is actually to get justice for Nancy Guthrie, the fastest path runs through federal investigators who can act on it immediately, who have subpoena power, who can move on a tip in hours. If your goal is to generate attention, or money, or both, TMZ is exactly where you'd go instead. Maybe I'm wrong about that. People do strange things when they're scared, and fear doesn't always lead anyone toward the smartest option available. But every time I come back to this case, that's the choice I keep getting stuck on. None of that settles the question of whether this video exists. But the choice of where to send the message is itself a piece of evidence about what the sender actually wants. Timing matters here too, because the timing of this latest message isn't random either, and it matters more than people are giving it credit for. This case has gone quiet publicly over the last several weeks. No major updates, no press conferences, the kind of stretch where public attention starts to drift somewhere else, the way it always does with these cases eventually, no matter how much a family or a community wants it to stay front and center. And then, right as that attention is fading, a message arrives claiming to have the most explosive piece of evidence yet, a video, her last day alive. That phrasing alone is built to pull eyes back to the story. If you were trying to manufacture renewed interest in a case that was losing oxygen, this is almost exactly the move you'd make. Drop something that sounds enormous, sounds final, sounds like the missing piece everybody's been waiting for, right at the moment attention starts slipping. That doesn't prove it's fake. Real breaks in real cases do sometimes happen to land at moments like this, purely by coincidence. But investigators who've worked extortion and hoax cases for years have told reporters that this kind of timing, attention fading, then a dramatic claim appearing, is a pattern they've seen before, and it's not usually a pattern that ends with real evidence in hand. What happens to families in situations exactly like this one doesn't get discussed enough, and it matters for understanding why claims like this can't simply be ignored, even when they're probably not true. When you're the family of someone who's missing, especially missing under circumstances this violent, every single message that comes in carries weight. You can't just switch off. Even the ones you logically suspect are fake, even the ones investigators have told you, privately, are probably not credible. Because the alternative, the one where you ignore a message and it turns out to have been real, is unbearable in a way that almost nobody outside that situation can fully understand. So families in this position end up living inside two realities simultaneously. The rational one, where they understand statistically that most of these messages are exploitative noise, and the emotional one, where they cannot fully let go of even the smallest chance that this particular message might be different. That tension doesn't resolve. It just gets carried, day after day, for as long as the case stays open. Nancy Guthrie has talked publicly, carefully, about believing two of the earlier notes were real. Part of what's happening there isn't just an assessment of evidence. It might also be a person trying to hold on to something that feels like forward motion in a case that has otherwise stretched into months of silence. That doesn't make her wrong. It also doesn't make the evidence stronger. Those are two separate things, and it matters to hold both of them at once instead of collapsing them into one simple conclusion. 5 months, one missing woman, two notes that experts believe are probably real, and a growing pile of messages after them that look less and less like they belong to the same person. There is a real, active, ongoing federal investigation with FBI personnel reportedly dedicated specifically to tracing the digital origin points of these various communications. They've reportedly had some success tracing portions of the original Bitcoin wallet activity. They have not, as of this recording, identified or apprehended the man visible on that doorbell camera, despite many months of sustained effort. There is this newest claim of an actual video showing Nancy with her alleged main captor that nobody outside the person making the claim has been able to verify in any way. It arrives with enough significant red flags: the refusal to provide any proof whatsoever, the relatively small Bitcoin demand compared to the substantial legitimate reward sitting openly available, the choice of a public tabloid channel over a direct, protected law enforcement channel, that experienced investigators are treating it with considerable, justified skepticism. And underneath all of the competing theories, all of the expert analysis, all of the speculation, there remains an 84-year-old woman who has now been missing for nearly 5 months. A family that has been told, through deeply unsettling written communications, that she is likely dead, but who has never actually had her remains returned to them. And a sprawling community of professional investigators and dedicated amateur researchers, all racing in their own ways to determine who among all these voices is actually telling the truth before any more time slips away. If genuine evidence does exist somewhere on some device, sitting in some undisclosed location, the fastest, safest path to getting that evidence into the right hands was never a public auction conducted through a tabloid tip line. It's a direct, protected channel to federal investigators, an arrangement specifically designed to protect both the information itself and the person providing it. That pathway has existed this entire time. It still exists right now. The fact that it hasn't been used yet tells you something important, even if nobody can say with certainty exactly what that something is. If you have any genuine information about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. If you would prefer to remain anonymous, there's a separate number for that as well, and we'll include both in the description below. The combined reward currently on the table exceeds $1.2 million, available entirely through legitimate, protected channels. Let me know in the comments what you actually make of this latest claim. Do you think there's an actual video sitting out there somewhere? Or do you think this is someone capitalizing on a tragedy that has already consumed an entire family for months? And what do you make of the theory that this may have been a carefully targeted, planned abduction, rather than some burglary that simply went wrong? I want to know exactly where you're landing on this, because I don't believe the answer here is obvious. If you're new to this channel, subscribe. We're going to keep tracking every meaningful development in this case as it comes in, for as long as it takes to get Nancy Guthrie's family real answers. See you in the next one.